If the speakers could come forward, please. Since this is the first session, I've been told to sort of set the stage and the tone and the timing. And so, speakers, if you could come and take your places. For each of these sessions, then, there will be no formal introductions or bios. Each speaker will have 15 minutes. They will all go consecutively. I'll have a 5-minute response, and then the floor will be open, because I know there are a lot of specialists here in the room, a lot of experience, so I presume there will be a lot of questions. So without further ado, Alastair, where? Sorry? Oh, all right. Well, okay, so let me tell you about the Canadian experience with our 300,000 person cohort, because it's just, when you come here and you see Estonia, Biobank, and a lot of the early pioneers who struggled with the issues of broad consent, who already imagined the difficulties with limited feedback. Now, there is feedback in these resource biobanks. There's constant ongoing communication for updates, for questionnaires, for access requests. So it's not as though it's a one-time free-for-all, as is often portrayed in the press. But as we'll see tomorrow, whereas an internal biobank can sort of keep the philosophy alive in its participants, the outside access requests often do create difficulties. Alastair, I was filling in while I was waiting for you, and so now I don't have to talk anymore about what's happening in longitudinal. It's a great pleasure to welcome an old friend, a renowned scholar, and a lot of you were here last night to hear him. So, Alastair, you have 15 minutes on the drafting the ethics and governance framework.
Sorry to cause you anxiety, but
no.
I'm here now. So, anniversaries are strange things. Actually, it's quite a relief to me that this is 10 years, because the other anniversary I'm involved in is the 40th anniversary of the publication of the Journal of Medical Ethics, which will be next year, and of which I was the first editor. So I don't want to have my brain scanned to find out how far it's deteriorated in the 40 years since I set up the Journal of Medical Ethics. So in the 15 minutes I have, I just want to sketch in the start of this, and here's the outline. So I'll talk about the Interim Advisory Group and explain about how that was set up, what its membership was. Then we'll look at the development of the Ethics and Governance Framework, and then I'll finish with what we're seeing at that time as some key issues that would have to be dealt with in the framework, and some quite lively discussion in the IAG about some of these issues. So the Interim Advisory Group was established by the Biobank funders in February 2003. It was partly a response to public consultations which had been carried out beforehand. It was quite an extensive process of consultation with the whole project to understand how the public would view it and what concerns they might have. But in addition to that, there were other pressures coming, questions being asked by MPs, suggestions that somehow the what would be needed is a really tight piece of legislation to make sure that this thing went correctly. And so there was on the funders at this point a question of where do we go from here in terms of having a viable project, but at the same time meeting these public concerns. And so the way that they decided to do this was to set up this group, the Interim Advisory Group, and that group's task was to look at the various requirements that were coming from the public and elsewhere, and to ask how can we best deal with these. And the topics of the group were, of course, could be wider than that as well, because really our task was to set up a whole framework of this novel project that would make a mark, because it, as has already been said by me last night, the ethics had changed. The ethical issues were different. and we really had to examine that. So we had this group then. It was chaired by Bill Lawrence, and Bill, I'm saying this although I don't want to embarrass him, but an absolutely brilliant chair who did far more than just control this committee. Not the easiest thing to do, as you'll see when you see the membership, but also all the work that he did in between, and that really, it could not have been done, I think, without that kind of chairmanship. So there were two philosophers on the committee, Honora O'Neill and myself, and two lawyers, Graham Laurie and Jean McHale. There was one one sociologist, also a scientist, of course, Erica Hames, and then one geneticist, Christopher Matthew. And then there were two more members who were originally called lay members, but they objected to that. And they said, this makes it sound as though we are sort of second-class citizens. And in a sense, we were all lay. We were all not. We each had our expertise, and so they became known as simply the members of the board. And then it was the secretary was Joe Sumner, and Joe, with Bill, did an amazing job in between meetings in terms of preparing the documents that we required for our discussions. So what was the process? Well, we were provided with drafts of the ethics and governance framework, and our meetings basically were going through these drafts and then revising and then meeting again and so on. We met 3 times, I think the previous slide mentioned it, in 2003, and then there was a gap, and then another meeting in 2004, between which there had been further public consultations. So one of the things that was important was to decide what the structure of the ethics and governance framework should be. How are we actually going to plan it in a way that was accessible and understandable and was meeting the main concerns. So that was decided, and then we debated the key issues that were raised within the structure. One of the big concerns that had come from the public consultation was the feeling that such a project required proper, continuous ethical oversight. The phrase that was used at that time was an oversight body was required. And so this is one of the factors that influenced the way we discussed what should happen. There were other concerns, worries about the genetic aspect, and worries about the possibility of commercialization, that actually the resource would be taken over by interest groups with money rather than fulfilling its purposes. There was a constant interaction with the funders and with those who were now setting up Biobank, the chief executive, that time principal investigator. So there was a very good interchange, but there was no question of us being told what to write. It was a matter of sharing with them how we saw it. And here's the really important thing. The ethics and governance framework was to be UK biobanks. In other words, it was to be, once it was agreed, it was to be adopted by the biobank. So instead of saying, well, those people over there are telling us we shouldn't do this and shouldn't do that, Biobank is saying we are committed to this. This is our commitment on ethics. And that is hugely important. At the same time, it wasn't thought that it should be set in stone, but that it should be open to subsequent revision. And so discussion has continued and will continue about where the ethics and governance framework could do with some changes, with changing needs and situations. And of course, the example of imaging, which has come in since, is a very good example of the way in which the EGF and the bank has to look at what was an initial stance about no feedback. And of course, it's a public document, so full access to the ethics and governance framework by participants and by the public. Another thing that was extremely important from the start, as we looked at the idea of setting up an oversight body, or if you now got the name the Ethics and Governance Council, as it now is called, is the independence of this body. That although it was monitoring and communicating with the UK Biobank, it was to be separate from the UK Biobank, and although it is funded separately, it is the same funders, but it's a separate funding, so that there is no question of the actual council itself being under the control of Biobank. Another thing that was very important to the public. So most of you will be familiar with this, I expect, and of course you can look at it on the website, but here is the way it was structured: relationship to participants, relationship with research users, relationship with society, and then the implementation and revision requirements, including what should happen if the biobank closed down. I'm not going to go through all these in any detail, there's no time for that, but I would pick up under 2 the word stewardship. It's an interesting word. The steward is more than a custodian. The steward is a person who makes sure that the resource is appropriately used. So stewardship is an active role. Custodian is a kind of guardian role. Steward is holding it, the resource, but then ensuring its proper use. And I think that was seen as a very key point in our discussions. And ownership is not in the deal here. So the question of who owns it actually doesn't appear at all. But the responsibility of UKB, or UK Biobank, is to steward the resource. So in what I reckon is 2 minutes I've got left, Barter, is it? Or maybe it's 3 or?
3.5.
3.5, okay. So she cuts a tough deal, but that's fine. So in the discussions, a whole series of topics were discussed. Some I want to spend a slightly longer on. So broad consent. Obviously, this is a highly relevant topic still being discussed. The idea that you could have people agreeing simply to enroll in Biobank on the understanding that what would that mean, but never knowing exactly which research would be carried out, except it would be in the overall purposes of Biobank. And in my lecture last night, I wanted to stress, and I stress again, this is not blanket consent. It's broad consent because it's still consent to projects within the definition of the purposes of Biobank. Secondly, the idea of commercial use, again, very controversial, a lot of discussion, but it was already eventually agreed that, in fact, there could be commercial entities using the resource, provided the use of it was in conformity with the overall purposes of the biobank. So no automatic veto on commercial use. Feedback was discussed, and again, this emerged in the questioning here, and the general position was taken that it was not appropriate to promise feedback. And this is partly because we were very concerned that people wouldn't enroll in Biobank thinking it was a health check, that it was for their personal health checkup. And we thought that would be, as it were, a misleading way of recruiting people. So they were told there would be no feedback. We know there is basic feedback at the actual event when you enroll of things like blood pressure and body mass index. But beyond that, no. Withdrawal, again, very important. If it's broad consent, can you withdraw? And there were 3 types of withdrawal. The most extreme one, as it were, being that your samples would be destroyed. I've said it already, the Ethics and Governance Council has to be independent. It has to be free to make its views known to the public and to the biobank. And this comes to the last one, and perhaps the most important one. I discovered from going through the minutes of this meeting, these meetings, which of course are confidential, so I can't talk about them, but I will, that I was the one on the board that suggested the analogy of the dog, of the watchdog. And the question is, does this dog bark only, or does it bark and bite In other words, can the Ethics and Governance Council stop something? Say, no, we don't approve of this. That was the liveliest debate of all on the IAG. The majority view in the end was that, in fact, a BARC would be just as effective, and it would not put inappropriate responsibility on the Ethics and Governance Council, but rather the Ethics and Governance Council should remind the Biobank of its purposes and point out you're not fulfilling them in this respect, so you have to do something about it, and if need be, it'll be made public. Now, that continues to be controversial, and the paper was published some time after the meeting of the IAG by one of the members of the group that used the phrase a toothless tiger. Well, tigers don't bark, but I think they do growl. But anyway, I don't think it's a toothless tiger. I think it's a very important watchdog that so far has been able to give warnings that had to be given. And that's all I have to say. Thank you very much.